allowed the boat to deliver its cargo on the beach and then quickly retract. This ability to get in and out was crucial to an operation as massive as the D-Day landing, which was the largest amphibious landing in history. Years later, President Eisenhower would call Andrew Higgins the man who won the war for us. Maybe the Higgins boat won that war, but the Navy hasn't stopped trying to improve on it. The current state of the art is the LCAT, or Landing Craft Air Cushion. Introduced in 1987, its hull never touches water or land. It is a classic hovercraft.
This means that it travels over water and over land on a cushion of air. The craft is supported by a full rubber skirt. There are lift fans on board which push air into the skirt and thereby keeping the craft up on cushion.
4 gas turbine engines capable of pumping 16,000 horsepower lift and propel the vehicle by forced air alone. Carrying a 60-ton payload, 15 times the capability of the Higgins boat, she can reach 70% of the world's shores, traveling at speeds of 50+ miles an hour.
At these freeway speeds, she can come up to the beach, does not have to stop at the beach, but can transverse across into firmer ground, less exposed.
The military looks for tactical advantage in designing beach vehicles. For civilians, the name of the game is fun. Bruce Myers didn't invent the dune buggy, he just made it more enjoyable and accessible. He was the Henry Ford of dune buggies, and his Model T was the Myers Manx. In 1964, the first Manx hit the beach. Myers' whimsical design called for a 1960s Volkswagen Beetle as its base, with one key difference. The lower chassis, or floor pan, would have to be shortened by about 14 inches. This made the buggy stouter and stronger, with a tighter turning radius. But the crowning glory was the molded fiberglass body that went on top. This dropped the weight to a sporty 1,200 pounds and gave the Manx its distinctive look. But you couldn't buy the Manx in a store. If you came up with the VW lower half, Myers would sell you a $400 kit that included the upper half, the dashboard, hood, and body, with explicit directions on putting it all together. He sold over 6,000 of the kits and helped launch a national craze for off-road vehicles. San Francisco, 1896. Wealthy industrialist Adolf Sutro takes the beach inside. Built right on the city's rugged western shore, historic Sutro Baths was the largest indoor swimming pool ever built.
It was enclosed in an enormous glass and steel structure, so you could see the weather outside. It was, in a way, a beach packed into a building.
Sutro filled his pools with fresh seawater that was channeled in at high tide and then fed into 6 swimming pools, which held over 1.8 million gallons. Incredibly, it took only an hour to fill all the tanks. Along the way, the water was heated to various temperatures for the different pools.
The size of this was absolutely enormous. The whole sequence of structures filled about 3 acres and could accommodate up to 20,000 visitors in a single day.
And if those visitors needed a swimsuit, they could rent one of the 20,000 the baths had available to the public. The simple black jersey one-piece was far different from what swimwear had been and what it was about to become. In the beginning, swimwear was not for swimming, it was for modesty. A flash of a woman's leg was taboo, and one would go to great lengths to keep her bathing dress down in the water.
They wore weights in the hems of their garments. They had to prevent themselves from being seen.
By the turn of the 20th century, heavy knee-length wool dresses with bloomers and stockings were standard. But in 1907, scandal erupted when a world champion swimmer named Annette Kellerman wore a tight-fitting one-piece suit that exposed her legs.
She pioneered the first functional swimsuit that is not a bathing costume, but an actual costume in which one could move through water.
For this liberating act, she was arrested for public indecency, as were many of her followers. But there was no turning back. And suddenly, manufacturers were on a search for the perfect fabric that could be both fashionable and practical. In the 20s, it was tightly knit, long-fibered wool. In the 30s, rubberized fabric called lastex allowed for suits that fit like a second skin, but still covered enough to be modest. Then, after World War II, a bombshell. Named after the Bikini Atoll, an atomic test site in the Pacific Islands, the naval-bearing bikini shocked everyone when it was introduced in 1946. So much that it wasn't until the youth explosion of the 60s that those barely visible swimsuits were popping up everywhere. The 70s and 80s saw plenty of these revealing suits, many made from a newer synthetic called Lycra. An elastic fiber, Lycra can stretch up to 5 times its original shape and still fit perfectly. The latest in a long line of so-called miracle fabrics is microfiber. 100 times smaller than a human hair, microfiber resembles a pie in cross-section, with many finer fibers along its entire length. Strong and light, it's a far cry from the heavy wool swimsuits of 100 years ago. But with advances in technology, the strongest protection on the beach today is not a swimsuit at all. The chemicals in sunscreen now allow us to expose more skin than ever, while still protecting us from the sun's cancer-causing ultraviolet rays. Beginning in the 20s, scientists made preparations of zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, whose particles reflect ultraviolet rays. Developed in 1943, PABA, short for para-aminobenzoic acid, was the first organic sunscreen. Unfortunately, it would stain clothing, and many people were allergic to its chemical makeup. So today, most sunscreens are PABA-free. These modern sunscreens actually absorb UV radiation in much the same way that darker skin pigment does, by converting these UV waves to heat and then dissipating them harmlessly. Sun protection is a must for anyone at the beach, even if you're in the water, waiting for waves of another kind. Modern surfing has roots that go back hundreds of years in Hawaii. And up until the 20s and 30s, many surfboards were handmade of redwood, up to 15 feet long, and could weigh up to 200 pounds.
200-pound boards were the redwood days, which was before my dad. My dad was started with balsa, and balsa's actually pretty light.
In 1950, Hobie Alter, a surfer himself, began making balsa surfboards in his garage in Laguna Beach, California. He would laboriously glue the wood together and then shape it with a router that he mounted on a jig. Then he would plane it, sand it, and then have it glassed, a messy process that sealed the board with fiberglass resin. For 7 years, he made surfboards this way, completing only around a dozen a week. But space-age technology was about to change everything. In 1957, a material called polyurethane foam would transform Hobie's shop and an industry.
The
difference there would be you could mass produce boards. Foam was like shaping a stick of butter compared to a piece of solid wood.
Today, it all begins with a foam blank, which is quickly roughed out by hand and then prepared for glassing. But when demand is high, a computerized shaping machine, a direct descendant of Hobie's old router on a jig, takes care of business 2 at a time. The exact measurements are programmed in, and the foam flies in fractions of an inch.
It takes a large mass of foam and brings it down to a level where I can finish it off by hand. Even if it's roughed by me or if it's roughed by the machine, someone still has to come along and fine-tune the board. From that point, it goes to the glasser.
At the glassing shop, pigment is mixed with resin, and the glasser goes to work.
What they basically do is they lay a board out, deck down, cut fiberglass cloth over the entire board, cut it out to the basic shape of the board with a little bit of an overlap, maybe 2 inches, pour catalyzed resin on top of it and squeegee it out onto the board and make a nice tight bond between your foam and the fiberglass cloth. And then they do the same process on the top with 2 layers, and then from there it goes on to putting a sanding coat of resin on.
Then it's sanded, glossed, and then buffed to a high sheen, ready for the wave.
There's a lot of boards going through the process, but every single board means something to somebody. And it's kind of neat that every board is just brings someone some little bit of happiness, and they go out and try it, and it's just, you know, continues the cycle.
The sun is high, the waves are sparkling, and your eyes are killing you. You need sunglasses, but not any pair will do. Simple darkened lenses to cut out excess light have been around since the 18th century, but they did nothing to keep out the glare from harsh, reflected light. By the mid-20th century, polarized lenses were a sight for sore eyes. Before inventing instant photography, Edwin Land patented a cellophane-like polarizing filter in 1929, which made it possible to block rays of polarized light, or light waves traveling in one direction. Today, microscopic crystals are embedded between layers of glass.
The alignment of crystals are in one direction that blocks polarized light. And when you have reflected light, it's strongly polarized, meaning it's traveling in a single plane. And when you have a single plane of light reach the polarized lens, which has the crystals lined up in a way to block that plane of light, that plane doesn't go through the lens.
Sunglasses let you stay in the sun a little longer. But if you want to stay in the water longer, you'd better have a wetsuit.